Hey guys, tonight we find ourselves stepping onto the shores of a place that was for many the absolute end of the world early colonial Australia. Imagine the blinding sun, the bizarre calls of unseen birds, the scent of eucalyptus sharp in your nostrils, and the unsettling feeling that everything, the plants, the animals, the very ground beneath your feet, is alien and probably out to get you. You've heard the stories perhaps of the brave pioneers, but tonight we're looking at a different side of things. The rough justice and forgotten punishments meted out to those early settlers, particularly the convict arrivals. Honestly, with the rules back then, you probably wouldn't survive a week without finding yourself on the wrong end of a rather unpleasant surprise. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It always means a lot to hear from you, so feel free to drop your location and local time in the comments below. It's fascinating to see where everyone is tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing that hits you even before your feet touch the sand of this new strange continent is the smell. After months at sea, packed into the damp, swaying confines of a transport ship, any land would smell sweet. But this is different. It's a curious mix of salt, dry earth and a sharp, almost medicinal tang from the endless gray-green trees that crowd the shoreline. The eucalyptus, though, you don't have a name for it yet. As you're finally herded from the longboat, stumbling onto the beach at Sydney Cove in the fledgling colony of New South Wales, the sheer, overwhelming newness of it all is a physical blow. The light is different here, harsher, more brilliant than the muted skies of England. The sounds are a cacophony of screeching birds you can't identify and the buzzing of insects that seem far too interested in investigating your weary face. You might swat at them a futile gesture that only serves to remind you of your own exhaustion. Welcome to your new home, courtesy of His Majesty's government. Your crime, whether it was stealing a loaf of bread or something more substantial, has led you to the very edge of the known world. You're part of what would become known as the First Fleet, a flotilla of 11 ships that carried over 1,000 souls, convicts, marines, officers, and a few free settlers, to establish this penal colony in 1788. A grand experiment, some called it, a dumping ground, others muttered. For you, it's simply the stark reality of your sentence. The formal proclamation of British law happens swiftly. You see the king's colors unfurled, hear the familiar pronouncements of authority. On paper, the laws are those of England. You understand theft is wrong, assault is punished, and murder carries the ultimate price. These are the rules you grew up with, twisted versions of which perhaps led you here. Yet almost immediately there's a subtle or perhaps not so subtle shift in their application. It's in the glint in the marine's eye, the weary expediency of the newly appointed magistrates, the vast, unforgiving landscape itself, that seems to strip away the niceties of courtroom procedure. Historians still argue whether the initial legal framework was intended to be a direct replica of the British system, or if it was immediately adapted, perhaps even simplified, for the unique, desperate circumstances of a penal colony struggling for survival. What you experience on the ground is a version of justice that feels raw, quicker to judgment. There's an unspoken understanding that order in this precarious new settlement, clinging to the edge of a continent, must be maintained at all costs. The niceties of extensive legal argument, the possibility of lengthy appeals. These seem to have been largely left behind on the docks of Portsmouth. Here, the distance from the established centers of power in Britain creates a vacuum where local authority, often embodied by military officers or hastily appointed officials, becomes paramount. The rules might be old, but the game feels terrifyingly new, and the referees seem to be making it up as they go along with your life as one of the playing pieces. Your first few nights are spent under rudimentary shelters, perhaps a canvas tent shared with too many others, or a hastily constructed hut of wattle and daub that offers minimal protection from the surprisingly chilly nights or the relentless sun during the day. The rations are meager salted meat, often of dubious quality, coarse flour, perhaps some dried peas. Scurvy, dysentery, and simple hunger are your constant companions, a background hum of misery that makes the enforcement of rules even more acute. It's a simple equation. Really, a hungry, desperate population is a potentially unruly one. And so the colonial administration, led by Governor Arthur Phillip, a man tasked with the monumental challenge of carving a society out of wilderness and perceived criminality, knows that a firm hand is essential. You soon learn that what might have earned you a stern warning or a few days in the local jail back in England could have far more severe consequences here. Perhaps you grumble too loudly about the food, or you're caught trying to trade your meager ration of rum for a bit more bread. The response is swift. There isn't the luxury of lengthy investigations. One of the rather interesting, if grim, realities of this new life is how quickly your past skills or lack thereof define your existence. If you were a farmer, a carpenter, or a blacksmith, back in the old country, you might find yourself in slightly higher demand, put to work on essential tasks for the colony's survival. This doesn't mean you escape the overarching harshness. Not by a long shot, but it might mean slightly better rations or work that feels marginally less like pure punishment. Conversely, if your skills were more urban, shall we say, a pickpocket, a forger, you find those talents distinctly unappreciated and are likely assigned to the most grueling, unskilled labor, like clearing land or quarrying stone under the blazing sun. It's a brutal but effective form of social re-engineering. The colony needs builders, not burglars, and the system is designed to remind you of this at every turn. It's almost a dark little joke, isn't it? You're shipped across the world for your criminal talents, only to find they're the last thing anyone wants from you now. You might notice the curious attempts to maintain decorum amidst the chaos. Early court sessions, for instance, might be held in a large tent, or even under the shade of a substantial gum tree, with magistrates trying to uphold the dignity of the law while swatting away flies and contending with the sounds of construction and the general hubbub of a camp still finding its feet. It's a mainstream historical fact that the early administration put enormous effort into establishing the appearance of orderly British justice, even when resources were laughably scarce. This performance of legality was crucial, they believed, to remind everyone, convict and free settler alike, that this was not a lawless frontier, but an extension of the Crown's dominion. Yet the edge, you feel, is in the details. Perhaps it's the summary nature of trials for minor offenses, the lack of legal representation for convicts, or the stark choices of punishment presented the lash, or even more backbreaking labor. The concept of assignment also begins to take shape early on. If you're not directly employed on government works, you might be assigned to a free settler, or an officer essentially becoming their indentured servant. This introduces another layer to the legal and punitive landscape. Your master now has considerable power over your daily life, your rations, your work, and crucially, your punishment for perceived transgressions. While they can't inflict the most severe penalties themselves without recourse to a magistrate, their reports in their favor can mean the difference between a tolerable existence and a truly miserable one. This new land, therefore, doesn't just come with new rules from the top. It comes with a whole new hierarchy of petty tyrants and potential saviors, all operating under the vast, indifferent sky of this strange continent. The old rules of Britain are still there. A ghostly framework, but they are now fleshed out with a colonial pragmatism that often feels like a heavier, sharper instrument. You learn quickly to keep your head down, to watch, to listen, and to try against all odds to navigate this new world, where the ground beneath your feet is as unsteady as the application of its laws. The air itself seems to hum with a silent warning: step out of line and the consequences will be unforgettable. That silent warning, the one that seemed to hum in the very air of this new settlement, soon takes on a more tangible, more visceral form. Among the array of tools designed to enforce the old rules with a harsher edge, you're now living under one instrument quickly becomes infamous. Its mere mention enough to send a shiver down your spine. You hear it whispered about in the cramped barracks, see the old hands flinch when a certain tone is used by an overseer. It's the cat o' nine tails, a name that sounds almost whimsical until you understand its grim reality. This isn't some forgotten relic of a bygone age you only read about. It's a very present threat, the colony's most readily applied solution for a multitude of perceived sins. You might first encounter it not as a recipient, thankfully, but as a witness. Perhaps you're part of a work gang toiling under the already oppressive sun when a fellow convict is accused of idleness, or perhaps of answering back to the overseer with a touch too much spirit, or what they call insolence. The process is chillingly swift. There's no lengthy trial, no real chance for defense. The overseer makes the call and a message is sent. Soon the dreaded triangle is erected, a sturdy wooden frame to which the unfortunate individual will be tied. Or sometimes it's simply a sturdy gum tree, its bark already scarred from previous similar occasions serving the same grim purpose. The air grows heavy, a hush falling over your fellow workers. Everyone avoids eye contact, focusing intently on their task, yet every ear is strained listening. The cat itself is a brutal implement. Typically, it's a whip with multiple lashes or tails, often 9 as its name suggests, made of knotted cord or leather. Each tail is designed to bite and sting. You don't need to see it up close to understand its potential. The very posture of the man assigned to wield it, often another convict chosen for his brawn, or perhaps his own desperate need to curry favor, speaks volumes. It's a mainstream historical fact that flogging was an incredibly common punishment in the early Australian penal colonies, with records detailing tens of thousands of lashes administered for a vast range of offenses from serious crimes like assault or theft, down to things that would barely raise an eyebrow today, neglect of work, being out of barracks after hours, or even singing a prohibited song. 25 lashes might be considered a light punishment, while 50, 100, or even more were not uncommon for more significant infractions or repeat offenders. It was the colonial administration's go-to response, a sort of grimly efficient multi-tool for behavior adjustment. The ritual unfolds with a dreadful predictability. The accused is stripped to the waist, their arms secured to the triangle. A drummer might be present not for musical accompaniment, but to beat a rhythm that some said was to drown out the cries, though others claimed it was to ensure the flogger kept a steady, effective pace. A surgeon, or at least someone with rudimentary medical knowledge, stands by. His role isn't primarily one of compassion. It's to ensure the prisoner doesn't expire or faint prematurely from the punishment, so that the full sentence can be carried out. If you collapsed, they'd often wait for you to recover, then continue. Such excellent medical attention, really ensuring you were fit enough to receive the entirety of your prescribed misery. You try not to look, but the sounds are unavoidable. The swish of the cat through the air, the sickening thud as it lands the sharp intake of breath from the victim. Sometimes a muffled groan or a cry, though many prided themselves on enduring it in silence, a last shred of defiance. The silence from the onlookers, your fellow convicts, is just as profound, a heavy blanket of shared fear and suppressed anger. Each thwack is a reminder of your own precarious position, how easily you could be the one tied there. Historians still argue whether the lash was genuinely intended as a reformative tool, a harsh lesson to steer convicts towards better behavior, or if it was purely an instrument of terror and subjugation, designed to break spirits and enforce absolute obedience through fear. From where you're standing with the sun beating down and the scent of sweat and fear in the air, the latter seems far more likely. One of the more unsettling, quirky little tidbits about this brutal practice is that the flogger himself was often a fellow convict. This individual, sometimes called the scourger or flagellator, might have been offered the role in exchange for slightly better treatment, extra rations, or even a recommendation for a ticket of leave somewhere far down the line. Imagine that psychological dynamic, being flogged by someone who, just yesterday, might have shared your meager meal or whispered complaints about the overseers alongside you. It was a masterful stroke of division, ensuring that resentment and fear were directed not just upwards towards the authorities, but also sideways amongst your own kind. Some of these convict floggers became notorious for their zeal, perhaps believing that excessive enthusiasm would earn them more favor, while others were said to perform their grim task with a reluctant mechanical detachment. The rules around the lash are something you learn quickly. You learn which overseers are quicker to recommend it, which magistrates are known for ordering higher counts. You learn to make yourself as inconspicuous as possible to follow orders without question, even when they seem pointless or demeaning. The fear of the cat becomes a constant companion, shaping your interactions, your work ethic, even the way you carry yourself. It's not just the physical pain, which by all accounts was excruciating, but the public humiliation, the degradation of being treated like an animal. And then there's the aftermath, the raw bleeding wounds that could take weeks to heal, often becoming infected in the unhygienic conditions. You'd see men struggling to work with freshly wounded backs, the fabric of their coarse shirts sticking to the half-healed flesh. It was a visible walking testament to the colony's harsh discipline. Sometimes, after a particularly severe flogging, a saltwater solution or brine would be applied to the prisoner's back. This was ostensibly for cleaning the wounds, a primitive antiseptic, but you can only imagine the searing agony it induced. It was often referred to as pickling about the eye, a term that speaks volumes about the casual cruelty of the era. It's a small wonder anyone survived such treatment, let alone found a way to carry on. You might find yourself thinking that the only thing worse than being the one at the triangle is being one of the many, forced to watch your stomach churning, knowing that any sign of sympathy or protest from your ranks would likely see you taking their place. It's a lesson in silent compliance delivered with brutal efficiency. The whispers of the lash are a constant soundtrack to your new life, a reminder that in this sunburnt land, the old rules have indeed found a terrifyingly sharp new edge. The sting of the lash, thankfully, isn't an everyday occurrence for every single soul in this sprawling, sun-baked prison, though its threat, as you've learned, certainly is. But there are other forms of control, other methods of reminding you of your status that are far more constant, a dull, grinding presence in your life rather than a sharp, acute agony. If the cat o' nine tails is the swift, brutal punctuation mark in the sentence of your servitude, then what you're about to experience is the unending, monotonous drone of the sentence itself. I'm talking, of course, about the chains, the irons, the constant, tangible weight of your conviction. You might earn your first set of leg irons for a failed attempt to abscond, or perhaps for repeated insubordination, or simply because you've been deemed a troublesome character by someone in authority whose wig felt a bit tight that morning. The process of being fitted is a grim ceremony in itself. You're taken to the blacksmith, a figure whose fiery forge and clanging hammer usually signify construction and progress, but for you now represent restriction and regression. He's likely another convict, his face impassive, as he selects the heavy iron rings and the connecting bar or chain. These aren't neat, polished things. They're rough, heavy, and uncompromising. The rings are hammered shut around your ankles, a shockingly permanent-feeling embrace. It's official, you're now sporting the latest in penal fashion, an accessory you certainly won't be taking off anytime soon. The weight is the first thing you notice. It's a dead, unforgiving heaviness that drags at your every step. A mainstream historical fact is that these leg irons could weigh anywhere from a few pounds for light versions to well over 10 or 12 pounds for standard sets, and even heavier specially made colonial irons were reserved for those deemed particularly difficult or for repeat escapees. Imagine trying to walk to work even just to stand with that constant, unyielding burden. Your gait changes immediately. You develop a shuffling, restricted walk, a sort of reluctant dance that other convicts call the convict shuffle, or the Botany Bay limp. It's the body's unwilling adaptation to its new reality. The irons chafe, of course. Raw sores can develop quickly around your ankles, and keeping them clean in the dusty, often unhygienic conditions is a constant battle. At night, there's no relief. You sleep in them, the cold iron, a constant reminder against your skin, the clinking sound accompanying every restless turn. Speaking of sounds, that's another thing, the constant jingle, clank, and scrape of iron on iron or iron on stone. It's a soundtrack to your misery, a public declaration of your status. Often these irons are just the first step. If you're deemed in need of closer supervision or harder labor, you'll find yourself part of a chain gang. This is precisely what it sounds like. You and a dozen or more other men, all in irons, are further connected by a long chain that runs from one prisoner to the next. Now your movement is not just restricted by your own irons, but tethered to the pace and actions of every other man on the chain. There's a horrible enforced intimacy to it. If one man stumbles, you all feel the jolt. If one needs to relieve himself, the entire gang might have to pause under the watchful and usually unsympathetic gaze of the overseers or marines guarding you. The work assigned to chain gangs is invariably the hardest, most unpleasant, and most visible building roads through dense bushland, quarrying stone for buildings, clearing vast tracts of land. It's backbreaking labor made infinitely more difficult by the encumbrance of the chains and the collective drag of the gang. You're a human earth-moving machine, slow, inefficient, and powered by sweat and fear. What a fantastic team-building exercise, though, wouldn't you say, albeit with rather low morale. Historians still argue whether the primary purpose of chain gangs was punitive labor designed to physically break men and deter others through public spectacle, or if it was a grimly pragmatic if brutal solution to the colony's desperate need for infrastructure with a reluctant workforce. Looking around at the sun-cracked landscape and the monumental tasks required to carve out roads and foundations, you can see the logic in the latter. But feeling the galling weight and the overseer's impatient glare, the punitive aspect feels far more personal and immediate. The guards, often Marines or specially appointed overseers, are usually armed and not known for their gentle dispositions. Their job is to extract the maximum amount of labor and prevent any thought of escape, a task they undertake with varying degrees of harshness. There's a peculiar, almost theatrical public nature to the chain gang. As you toil along a track that will one day be a road-free settlers or newly arrived ship's crews might pass by observing you with a mixture of pity, contempt, or perhaps a grim satisfaction that they are not in your place. You are a walking, clanking billboard for the consequences of falling foul of the law in this new land. It's a deliberate display of the power of the state, a constant reminder to all convict and free alike of the order that is being imposed inch by painful inch. Amidst this daily grind of discomfort and forced labor, small acts of ingenuity, or perhaps just desperate coping mechanisms emerge. A quirky tidbit you might observe is convicts attempting to muffle the sound of their chains. They might try to wrap scraps of cloth if they can get them, or even dried grass or leaves, around the most egregious clanking parts of their irons. This isn't usually about comfort, as little can truly alleviate that, but more about reducing the constant, jarring noise that announces your every move, or perhaps in the wilder dreams of some to allow for a slightly stealthier, though highly improbable escape attempt under the cover of darkness. These efforts are usually short-lived. The materials wearing out quickly or being spotted and removed by a vigilant overseer who probably thinks you're up to no good? Which, to be fair, you might be. Some convicts even developed specific slang terms for their irons, dark little jokes to cope with their situation, darling's jewelry after a particularly stern governor, or perhaps ankle deckers. Sleeping in a crowded hut with dozens of other men, many of them also in irons, is an experience in itself. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, and the night is punctuated by a symphony of coughs, groans, and the ever-present clinking and dragging of chains as men shift in their uneasy slumber. It's like a lullaby composed by a very pessimistic blacksmith. There's little rest to be had from my, and the dawn call to another day of hard labor in your metallic embrace comes all too soon. The psychological toll is immense. The chains are a constant physical manifestation of your captivity, a brand that marks you more effectively than any tattoo. They restrict not just your movement, but also your sense of self, grinding down your spirit with their relentless weight and the shame they represent. You are quite literally bound to your fate and to the other unfortunate souls who share your clanking, chafing reality. The constant clanking of your leg irons, the unwelcome camaraderie of the chain gang, the shouts of the overseers, these become the grinding soundtrack of your days. But then perhaps you commit an offense deemed too serious for just more labor, or you're marked as someone whose spirit needs a more focused kind of breaking. Suddenly the noise, the forced interaction, the very sky above you are snatched away. You're heading for a different kind of punishment, one whispered about with a unique kind of dread solitary confinement. If the chain gang was a public spectacle of your subjugation, this is its grim private counterpart, a descent into silence and stone. The charge might be striking an overseer, a desperate, ill-fated escape attempt, or perhaps persistent open defiance that the authorities can no longer tolerate. The sentence is pronounced with a chilling finality to the cells. You're marched away the familiar weight of your irons, now perhaps seeming even heavier as you approach the jail, or a specially constructed block of punishment cells. These aren't designed for long-term habitation even by convict standards. They are built for one purpose: to isolate, to unnerve, to crush. One particularly charming and quite mainstream historical fact is that the theory behind solitary confinement, popular in penal reform circles at the time, was that solitude would force a prisoner into quiet contemplation, leading to penitence and moral reformation. A sort of enforced spiritual retreat, if you will, though. The amenities package was, shall we say, severely lacking. The door to your new abode creaks open, revealing a space that barely qualifies as a room. It's small, often just a few paces long, a few paces wide. The walls are thick stone or heavy timber, damp to the touch, and seeming to swallow any sound. Light is minimal, perhaps a tiny, high-up slit of a window, barred and offering no view, or sometimes no window at all. These were often called dark cells. The air is stale cold and heavy with the silence of previous occupants' despair. Your bed, if you can call it that, is likely a hard wooden plank or perhaps just the stone floor itself, with a thin, coarse blanket if you're lucky. A bucket in the corner serves as your latrine. The guard shoves you in the door, slams shut with a sound that echoes with a dreadful finality, the heavy bolts thudding into place. And then, silence. At first, the silence is almost a relief after the constant din of the settlement or the chain gang. Your ears might ring for a while, adjusting to the sudden absence of noise. But soon the silence starts to press in. It's an active, encroaching thing, amplifying every tiny sound your own body makes. You're breathing the thump of your heart, the growl of your empty stomach. It's so profound you almost start to suspect your own ears have gone on strike, refusing to pick up any external stimuli. You pace if there's room. A couple of steps one way, a couple of steps back. You run your hands over the rough walls, searching for any imperfection, any sign of previous human presence. Time loses its meaning. With no sun to mark the day's passage, no work routine, no bells, minutes can stretch into hours, hours into an eternity. Your already meager rations are delivered with minimal interaction. A hatch might open a bowl of thin gruel, or a hunk of dry bread shoved through the hatch, slamming shut again, before you can even glimpse a human face. This is where the mind can become both your greatest enemy and your only companion. With no external stimuli, your thoughts run rampant. Memories, regrets, fears all swirl in the darkness. You might find yourself talking aloud just to hear a voice, even if it's your own. Though some cells were reputedly called dumb cells, where even making a noise was a punishable offense. It's a true test of your mental fortitude, a battle waged in the confines of your own skull. Sleep offers little escape, often bringing vivid, unsettling dreams, and you wake again to the same oppressive darkness, the same unyielding silence. The isolation is the true punishment here. Humans are social creatures, and to be utterly cut off, to feel entirely alone in the universe, is a uniquely chilling experience. You might even start to miss the guards you despise just for a flicker of human contact. A rather poignant, quirky tidbit from these solitary existences is the desperate ways convicts tried to combat the crushing loneliness and sensory deprivation. If they were lucky enough to have a tiny nub of chalk or a sharp stone, some would scratch patterns, count days, or even try to draw on the walls, leaving almost invisible messages of their presence for whoever might occupy the cell next. A tiny defiant whisper against the overwhelming silence. Others might try to communicate with prisoners in adjacent cells by tapping codes on the stone walls, or pipes desperate for any response, any confirmation that they weren't entirely alone in their stone-cold purgatory. Some even found company with the smallest of creatures, a spider in a corner, a beetle scuttling across the floor. Anything to break the monotony of their own isolated consciousness. Historians still argue whether solitary confinement was viewed by authorities primarily as a tool for psychological reformation, through forced introspection, as the penal theorists of the day sometimes claimed, or if it was a more straightforward, severe deterrent, a way to break the will of the most recalcitrant prisoners when other methods failed. From your perspective, trapped in the cold, silent dark, the philosophical intentions matter little. What you feel is the slow erosion of your senses, the unraveling of your thoughts. It's a stark contrast to the lash, which is all about immediate, overwhelming physical sensation. This is about the absence of sensation, the slow, creeping dread of being utterly, completely alone with nothing but the cold stone and the echoing emptiness of your own mind for company. It's like being buried alive, but with just enough air to prolong the experience. The duration of such confinement varied. It could be a few days for a minor infraction deemed worthy of a taste of the cells, or weeks, even months for more serious offenses, or for those individuals the authorities were determined to break. Emerging from solitary was an experience in itself. You'd be disoriented, your eyes painfully sensitive to the light, your voice hoarse from disuse if you hadn't been talking to yourself. You might be physically weaker from the poor diet and lack of movement, and psychologically, well, that varied. Some men emerged quieter, more subdued, the desired effect perhaps achieved. Others came out with a harder, more resentful glint in their eyes, their spirit not broken, but perhaps bent into a more dangerous shape. It was a gamble for the authorities, this descent into silence and stone, and a profound, often terrifying journey for the unfortunate soul who had to endure it. Your private studio apartment, as it were, offering terrible views, even worse service, and a social scene that was, to put it mildly, dead. Emerging from the deep, disorienting silence of a solitary cell blinking against a sun that suddenly feels impossibly bright. You might think that any change would be a relief. And perhaps for a fleeting moment, the simple act of seeing other faces, of hearing sounds beyond your own breathing, feels like a return to the world of the living. But this colony, as you're constantly learning, has a grim variety in its methods of correction. Soon enough, you're introduced to a form of labor that isn't about building the colony or providing a service. No, this is about toil for toil's sake, about pointless, painful effort designed to weary your body and numb your mind. Welcome to the world of the crank machine and the treadmill. You might be marched into a prison yard where these contraptions stand like instruments of some bizarre industrial torture. The treadmill is a large hollow cylinder, sometimes enormous, with wooden steps or slats fixed around its circumference. A line of convicts, you now among them, stand side by side along its length, grasping a handrail for balance. The goal to continuously step upwards as if climbing an endless, unyielding staircase. Your combined weight and effort turn the massive drum. A mainstream historical fact is that these treadmills, an invention of a British engineer named Sir William Cubitt, were sometimes employed for productive purposes like grinding grain or pumping water, hence their other name, the everlasting staircase, which sometimes actually did something. But just as often, particularly in purely punitive settings, they were set to grind the wind, meaning your immense effort achieved absolutely nothing beyond your own exhaustion and the satisfaction of the authorities. It's the ultimate in non-productive work. Makes you appreciate the deep, fulfilling purpose of, say, watching paint dry. Then there's the crank machine. This charming device usually consists of a handle much like a large meat grinder's protruding from a box. Inside the box, unseen by you, the crank turns a paddle or drum through a resistant material, often sand or gravel. Your task is to turn this crank endlessly against a resistance that can be adjusted by the warder to make it easier or more likely harder. Many of these machines were equipped with a counter and you'd be assigned a specific number of revolutions to complete in a day, perhaps 10,000 or even more. Imagine hour after hour the repetitive strain on your arms and shoulders, the monotony of the circular motion, the tiny mocking click of the counter, as you inch towards your daily quota of utter futility. It's like being forced to wind up the world's largest, most stubborn clock, a clock that only tells the time in units of misery. The physical toll of this labor is immediate and immense. On the treadmill, you're constantly fighting gravity, your leg muscles burning, your breath coming in ragged gasps. If you slow down, you risk missing a step and falling or being hit by the unforgiving wooden slats as they revolve. Overseers are always watching, quick to bark at anyone seen to be slacking. You work in shifts, perhaps 20 minutes on. Then a brief, inadequate rest period off the wheel while another group takes their turn before you're back on again. The crank machine offers no such illusion of teamwork. It's a solitary battle against the unyielding resistance, your muscles screaming and protest sweat dripping into your eyes. Dehydration is a constant risk, especially under the harsh Australian sun, if these machines are set up in an open yard with water often sparingly provided. And then there's the psychological aspect. The sheer mind-numbing pointlessness of it all is perhaps the cruelest part. At least with quarrying stone or clearing land, as brutal as it is, you can see a result however small. You can see a road slowly taking shape or a pile of bricks growing. But here, your sweat and agony produce nothing. The grain you might be grinding on the treadmill rarely seems to find its way into your own meager rations. The crank you turn grinds nothing but your own spirit. It's an exercise in futility designed, it seems, to empty your mind of everything but the raw ache of your muscles and the desperate longing for it to end. Some convicts would try to find a rhythm, a way to mentally escape the drudgery, perhaps by humming a tune in their head, or focusing on a tiny spot on the wall, anything to disconnect from the sheer, soul-crushing monotony. Historians still argue whether the sheer inefficiency of such labor was a design flaw, a byproduct of poorly understood penal theory, or a deliberate feature intended to psychologically torment convicts with the very futility of their efforts to show them that their time and energy were worthless. Whatever the intent, the effect on you is one of grinding despair. You see the same faces day after day, their expressions as blank and weary as your own. There's little conversation, just the rhythmic thudding and creaking of the treadmill, the groan of the crank machines, the heavy breathing of exhausted men, and the occasional sharp command from an overseer. It's a truly excellent cardiovascular workout if your primary fitness goal is achieving a state of complete physical and mental depletion. One quirky tidbit about these machines of torment is how warders or overseers sometimes had to be monitored themselves. For the crank machine with its adjustable resistance, a particularly sadistic guard might be tempted to tighten it excessively, risking injury to the convict or even damage to the machine itself if the prisoner simply couldn't turn it. Conversely, a more sympathetic or perhaps just lazy guard might set it too loose, defeating the punitive purpose. So there was this strange calibration act ensuring the punishment was perfectly pitched between agonizingly difficult and actually impossible. Sometimes it said convicts developed subtle ways of feigning utter exhaustion, collapsing dramatically just before their breaking point to earn a few precious moments of respite, a risky game that could earn them more punishment if the overseer saw through the act. The hours stretch into an eternity. Your body screams for rest, but the demand is relentless. A bell might signal the end of the workday on these machines, and you stumble away, every muscle trembling, every joint aching. There's no sense of accomplishment, just a hollow exhaustion. You've spent a day fighting an unwinnable battle against a machine designed to defeat you, and you know with a sinking heart that you'll likely have to do it all again tomorrow. This isn't about building a new life or even paying a debt to society in a constructive way. This is about being ground down quite literally by the cogs of a system that values your suffering far more than your potential. The only thing you're really manufacturing here is a deep, abiding weariness and a profound understanding of the word futility. After the relentless muscle-shredding, mind-numbing exertion of the treadmill or the crank machine, you might crave nothing more than to collapse in a heap unnoticed. But the colonial authorities have a whole repertoire of unpleasantness, and not all of it involves hidden suffering or exhausting labor. Sometimes the goal is quite the opposite: to make you and your alleged misdeeds as spectacularly, uncomfortably public as possible. So for your next corrective experience, you might find yourself stumbling towards the stocks or the pillory, those ancient instruments of public shaming given a fresh, sun-drenched airing in this new world. Perhaps your crime was one of public disorder, maybe a drunken brawl or loudly slandering a person of some minor import in the settlement. Or it could be petty theft, where the shame is considered as much a deterrent as any physical pain. Whatever the transgression, you're hauled out to a prominent spot, perhaps the dusty open space that serves as the town square, or right outside the main jail or courthouse, where everyone who's anyone and everyone who's no one like yourself will eventually pass by. This isn't about quiet reflection. It's about being made an example of a living, breathing cautionary tale for the edification of the masses. The original interactive street theater, if you will, where your role is regrettably the unwilling star. The stocks are typically a wooden framework with hinged boards that have holes for your ankles and sometimes your wrists as well. You're forced to sit often on a low, uncomfortable bench, or even on the ground with your limbs clamped firmly in place. The position is awkward, designed to become increasingly painful over time as your muscles cramp and your circulation protests. The pillory is generally considered a step up in the discomfort department. Here you stand with your head and hands thrust through holes in a similar wooden board, often raised on a platform to ensure maximum visibility. Trapped thus, you're completely exposed, unable to shield your face or swat away the ever-present Australian flies that take a particular interest in your predicament. What a splendid opportunity to work on your public speaking skills, or perhaps just to contemplate the questionable life choices that led you to this particular highly visible impasse. Being secured in one of these devices is a profoundly humiliating experience. The wood is rough against your skin, the fit unyielding. You hear the clunk of the boards locking into place, and with it comes a wave of vulnerability. You are immobilized, a target for whatever the day and the populace might throw at you, both literally and figuratively. A mainstream historical fact is that these forms of punishment were centuries old, brought directly from Britain, and were seen as a legitimate way to uphold public order and morality. The duration could vary from a few hours for a minor offense to a full day or even several days for more serious matters, often with no provision for food, water, or relief from the elements. You're at the mercy of the weather, baking under the relentless sun 1 hour, perhaps shivering in a sudden downpour the next. The reactions of the crowd are a crucial part of the punishment. This isn't just about physical discomfort. It's about enduring the scorn, ridicule, or sometimes even the outright anger of your peers and social superiors. Children might point and giggle emboldened by your helplessness. Stern-faced citizens might deliver impromptu lectures on morality as they pass. Others might actively participate in your shaming. Jeers, taunts, and insults are common. And then there's the pelting. Depending on your crime and your general popularity, or lack thereof, you might be bombarded with a variety of refuse. Rotten fruit and vegetables are classic choices, offering a satisfying splat. Mud clumps of dirt, perhaps some less identifiable organic matter from the street. It all adds to the sensory experience. You try to turn your head to flinch away, but there's little you can do except endure it. At least you get some fresh air, though. The refreshments, kindly provided by the audience, can leave a lot to be desired. Historians still argue whether the primary aim of public shaming punishments, like the stocks and pillory, was genuine deterrence for the individual offender and the wider community, or if it was more about reinforcing community norms, providing a ritualized, controlled outlet for public indignation, and thereby strengthening social cohesion. From your uncomfortable vantage point, with a piece of decaying cabbage slowly sliding down your cheek, such academic distinctions probably feel rather remote. What's clear is that it's deeply unpleasant and designed to make you feel utterly degraded. Amidst the general derision, however, you might encounter surprising moments. A quirky tidbit often overlooked in the grim tapestry of colonial punishment is that not everyone in the crowd was hostile. Sometimes a sympathetic soul, perhaps remembering their own struggles or believing your punishment to be excessive, might offer a small covert act of kindness. Someone might quickly pass you a drink of water when the guard isn't looking. Or a child not yet fully indoctrinated into the joys of public shaming might simply stare with wide, curious eyes devoid of malice. There are even accounts from older English traditions of friends of the condemned discreetly trying to shield them from the worst of the sun, or even attempting to bribe the less enthusiastic members of the crowd to aim their missiles elsewhere. Such moments would be rare, a tiny flicker of humanity in an otherwise bleak spectacle. The hours crawl by with agonizing slowness. Your limbs ache, your neck is stiff, and every jeer feels like a small hammer blow to your already battered dignity. You become acutely aware of your own smell, the filth accumulating on your clothes and skin, the burning shame that makes you wish the ground would swallow you up. When the time for your release finally comes and the boards are unlocked, you might struggle to stand, your muscles seized and unresponsive. You stumble away covered in grime, the laughter or muttered comments of the crowd following you. The physical discomfort will fade, but the memory of that public exposure, the feeling of being so utterly at the mercy of the mob, that's something that lingers. You've been made an example in a small, tightly knit colonial settlement where news and gossip travel fast. Your stint in the stocks or pillory will be remembered, a stain on your already compromised reputation. It's a potent lesson in the importance of conforming, or at least in the importance of not getting caught. The humiliation of the stocks, the jeers of the crowd, the aching stiffness in your limbs, these fade, eventually leaving you with a lingering sense of shame and a powerful thirst. But as you return to the monotonous grind of your convict life, another more persistent companion makes its presence felt: hunger. It's not the acute, desperate starvation of a famine, not usually, but a constant gnawing emptiness, a dull ache in your belly that colors every waking moment and saps your strength. You soon learn that in this new land of supposed opportunity food, or the deliberate lack of it, is yet another finely tuned instrument of control and suffering. The official convict ration, when you first hear it laid out, might not sound entirely terrible, at least on paper. There's a certain quantity of flour, usually coarse and a bit gray. Salted meat, either beef or pork preserved for its long sea journey. Perhaps some dried peas or lentils. A meager allowance of sugar, and maybe a pinch of tea. A mainstream historical fact is that these ration scales were dictated from afar by the Victualling Board in Britain, designed to provide the minimum necessary for survival and labor. However, the journey from paper pronouncement in London to your tin plate in Sydney Cove is fraught with peril, for the food that is. By the time it reaches you, the flour is often home to a thriving population of weevils, tiny, unwelcome guests who add a certain crunchiness to your damper. The salted meat, sometimes referred to by convicts with grim humor as mahogany, for its dark, unyielding toughness, can be years-old stringy and so salty it makes your eyes water. You'd spend more time trying to chew it than actually deriving any pleasure or significant sustenance. And that's if you get your full ration. Short measures are common, a little bit skimmed here by a corrupt storekeeper, a little bit lost there to spoilage on the long voyage or in the rudimentary colonial storehouses. The quality, as you've gathered, is often appalling. You learn to inspect your bread closely for unwanted protein in the form of insect life, and to boil your meat for hours in the hope of rendering it even vaguely edible. It's a monotonous diet day in, day out, the same unappetizing cycle of slightly off flour and incredibly salty, tough meat. You'd think the colonial catering service was deliberately trying to win an award for most consistently uninspiring cuisine. On the bright side, you'd certainly never have to worry about complex recipes or the foodie trends of the era. This baseline level of gastronomic disappointment is bad enough, but then there's the use of food deprivation as a direct punishment. Did you displease an overseer? Were you caught shirking your work, or perhaps engaging in a bit of illicit trading? Your already meager rations can be cut. You might be put on half rations, or for more serious infractions within the confines of the jail. Reduced to the classic punishment diet of bread and water. And the bread wouldn't be the nice, fluffy, artisanal loaf you might imagine. It would be the same coarse, dense stuff, just less of it, and the water often brackish and unappetizing. This isn't just about making you hungry, it's about weakening you, making you more compliant, making the thought of another day of hard labor on an empty stomach almost unbearable. The physical effects are insidious. That constant, low-level hunger translates into a pervasive lethargy. Your muscles ache more, your capacity for hard work diminishes, much to the annoyance of your overseers who likely blame your inherent laziness rather than the lack of fuel in your tank. You become more susceptible to disease. Scurvy, with its bleeding gums, joint pain, and horrifying weakness, is a constant specter in the early years of the colony, due to the chronic lack of fresh fruit and vegetables. A simple cut or abrasion can take longer to heal, more likely to become infected when your body is struggling just to maintain basic functions. You develop a very intimate relationship with your stomach. It's just that most of your conversations consist of it, grumbling, protesting, and generally making your life a misery. The psychological impact is just as profound. Food, or the lack of it, becomes an obsession. You dream about meals you once took for granted back in England. You scrutinize every morsel you're given, calculating how to make it last. The sight of someone else with a slightly larger portion, or perhaps a forbidden item they've managed to acquire, can fill you with an almost unbearable envy. Irritability flares easily when everyone around you is also hungry and on edge. It's hard to maintain a sunny disposition when your insides feel like they're eating themselves. Historians still argue whether the persistent inadequacy and poor quality of convict rations were primarily due to the very real logistical challenges of supplying a remote colony and the genuine scarcity of resources in the early years, or if it also reflected an unstated, perhaps even unconscious policy of keeping convicts in a state of perennial want, thereby fostering dependence and discouraging rebellion. Whatever the overarching reason, your daily reality is one of battling hunger. You see a clear hierarchy in access to sustenance. The officers, the free settlers, even some of the better connected or skilled convicts who perform essential trades, they often seem to fare better. They might have access to private gardens or the means to purchase or trade for fresher provisions. This visible disparity only sharpens the sting of your own deprivation. This constant hunger can also drive you to acts of desperation. A quirky tidbit you'd quickly learn is the astonishing and sometimes horrifying resourcefulness of starving men. Convicts were known to forage for anything remotely edible. Strange roots, berries, a dangerous gamble, as many local plants were poisonous, even insects, snakes, or the fat white grubs found in rotting wood. There are tales of men boiling grass or ferns in a desperate attempt to extract some nourishment, often with little success, and sometimes with dire consequences for their digestive systems. Stealing food was, of course, a serious offense, likely to land you a flogging or worse, but the gnawing in your belly could make even that risk seem worth taking. The illicit trading of rations also occurred. A portion of your precious salt meat for a bit of someone else's tobacco, or a sliver of your sugar for a needle and thread. Every transaction was a gamble. Every mouthful a small temporary victory against the pervasive hunger that defined so much of your existence in this land of punishment. That gnawing hunger, the monotonous food, the constant low-level misery. It all becomes the backdrop to your existence, but then your path might take another turn. Not every convict remains directly under government control, toiling in large gangs or confined to barracks. Many are assigned to private settlers, farmers, merchants, military officers, even government officials themselves, to serve as laborers, domestic servants, or skilled tradesmen if you happen to possess such abilities. This, you quickly learn, is like being entered into another kind of lottery, one where the prize might be a slightly more tolerable existence, or a ticket to a whole new circle of arbitrary suffering, all under your new master's thumb. The assignment system, a cornerstone of the early colonial labor structure, was presented as a practical solution. A mainstream historical fact is that it was designed to reduce the government's expense of maintaining thousands of convicts, while simultaneously providing much-needed labor to develop the fledgling colony's agriculture and infrastructure. In return for your unpaid labor, your master was supposed to provide you with basic rations. Often the same delightful government fare you're already accustomed to, though sometimes supplemented rudimentary lodging and clothing. It sounds almost reasonable on paper, doesn't it? A chance perhaps to be away from the immediate harshness of the government gangs and the ever-present threat of the triangles. But the reality, as always in your current unfortunate circumstances, is far more complex and deeply dependent on the character of the individual to whom you are assigned. Your new boss, well, it's a spin of the roulette wheel of fate. You might be assigned to a struggling farmer trying to carve a living out of the stubborn Australian soil, a man who, while demanding, might work alongside you and treat you with a degree of rough fairness simply because he needs your labor to survive. Or you could find yourself under the roof of a petty tyrant, someone who views you as little more than chattel to be worked to exhaustion and disciplined for the slightest perceived infraction. There are tales of masters who were relatively benign, even kind in their own way, and others who were notorious for their cruelty and unreasonable demands. Customer satisfaction, surveys for assigned servants, were, one imagines, not high on the colonial administration's list of priorities. You're marched out to your new master's property. It might be a small, struggling farmstead miles from the main settlement, where the isolation itself becomes a form of confinement. Or it could be a more established property, or even a household within the growing town of Sydney. Your new master looks you up and down, much like a farmer inspecting livestock. Your duties are laid out: clearing land, planting crops, tending animals if it's a farm, cooking, cleaning, endless chores if you're a domestic servant. The hours are long from sunup to sundown, and the work is invariably hard. Your accommodation could be a rough lean-to, a shared space in an outbuilding, or if you're exceptionally unlucky, just a spot on the kitchen floor. The master's power over you is immense. While they generally couldn't order you to be flogged directly without recourse to a magistrate, they hold the constant threat of doing so. One more mistake like that, and I'll have you before the bench becomes a common refrain. And you know that a magistrate is far more likely to believe the word of a free settler, a man of property, than that of a convicted felon. So you learn to tread carefully to anticipate your master's moods, to try and stay on their good side if they even have one. They control your access to slightly better food if they choose to provide it any small privileges. And critically, they write the reports that can influence your chances of eventually earning a ticket of leave, that first precious step towards conditional freedom. Arbitrary discipline is a constant worry. Perhaps you misunderstand an instruction, or you're deemed too slow in your work. Maybe the master is simply in a foul mood. The consequences can range from a tongue-lashing filled with inventive colonial curses to being given extra back-breaking tasks after an already exhausting day. Some masters might withhold a portion of your already meager supplementary rations or confine you to an outbuilding for a night with no blanket. It's a system ripe for wives with very little oversight in the more remote areas. You're effectively their property, and while there are some regulations about treatment, enforcing them is another matter entirely, especially when you have little power to make a complaint and even less chance of it being believed. Historians still argue whether the assignment system was ultimately more akin to slavery, given the lack of wages, the master's extensive power over the convict's person and labor, and the often brutal conditions, or if it was a particularly harsh form of indentured servitude that for a very small, fortunate few offered a pathway towards eventual freedom and integration into colonial society. For you on the ground sweating under the Australian sun, for a master whose temper is as unpredictable as the weather, the academic nuances are less important than the daily struggle for survival and the hope of avoiding punishment. One of the quirky tidbits of this system is the bush telegraph, the informal network of whispers and warnings that circulated among convicts about the reputations of various masters. Before being assigned, or if there was a chance of reassignment, you might desperately try to glean information. Who was known for being a good master? Who was a devil incarnate? This information, often pieced together from the snippets of conversation overheard in barracks or from convicts who had been returned to government service, could be incredibly valuable, though not always reliable. Sometimes convicts would even try to get themselves returned to government, deliberately performing poorly or committing a minor calculated offense if their assigned master was truly unbearable. A risky gamble, as being returned was often seen as a failure and could lead to punishment in itself. Conversely, some masters became heavily reliant on their assigned servants, especially those with valuable skills, leading to a complex, sometimes grudging interdependence. The isolation on a remote farm could be particularly challenging. Weeks might go by without seeing anyone other than your master's family and perhaps a few other assigned servants. There's no one to appeal to, no easy way to get word out if you're being mistreated. You are entirely at their mercy. The master's word is law and their home is your prison, albeit one without visible bars. You learn to read the signs to anticipate trouble, to make yourself as useful and as unobtrusive as possible, all while counting the days, months, and years until your sentence is served, or until you might earn that precious ticket of leave that offers a taste of freedom, however conditional. But until then, you remain under the settler's thumb, a pawn. In their efforts to tame a new land, your own dreams and desires ground down by the daily realities of servitude. Now your journey through this landscape of colonial punishment has so far largely trodden the path of a male convict. You've felt the sting of the lash, the weight of irons, the soul-crushing monotony of the crank machine. But imagine for a moment that your story was different, that your name was Mary or Elizabeth, not John or Thomas. What if you were one of the thousands of women transported to these distant shores, your crimes ranging from petty theft to more desperate acts committed in the poverty-stricken cities of Britain? Your experience of punishment, while sharing some grim commonalities with the men, would also have its own unique, disheartening flavor, often centered around an institution known as the female factory. If you are a woman newly arrived and unassigned to a master, or if your master has returned you for some infraction, real or imagined, or perhaps if you've fallen pregnant, this is likely where you'd end up. The female factory, with the most prominent one located at Parramatta, wasn't a factory in the modern sense of producing goods for commercial sale, though work was certainly a core component. A mainstream historical fact is that these institutions served a multitude of purposes. They were a place of confinement, a workhouse where female convicts performed labor for the government, a hospital, a nursery for the children of convict women, and quite controversially, a sort of de facto marriage bureau from which settlers and officials could select wives or domestic servants. It's your new home, and like most accommodations in this colony, the TripAdvisor reviews would probably be rather scathing. Stepping inside the high stone walls of the factory, the first things that might strike you are the sheer number of women and children crammed into a relatively small space and the cacophony of noise. The chatter of hundreds of voices, the cries of babies, the rhythmic thud of laundry work, the whir of spinning wheels. The air is thick with the smell of damp wool soap, unwashed bodies, and cooking often of the same uninspiring quality you've come to expect. Overcrowding is a constant issue, leading to a severe lack of privacy and often contributing to the spread of diseases. You're assigned a place in a large dormitory, sleeping on a simple palliasse or mat on the floor surrounded by dozens of other women, each with her own story of misfortune and resilience. Within the factory, there's often a strict class system. New arrivals, or those deemed well-behaved, might be placed in the first class with slightly better conditions, and perhaps lighter duties. The second class would be for general labor, while the third, or crime class, was for women being actively punished for offenses committed within the factory or the colony. Demotion to the crime class meant harder work, worse rations, and often confinement in more unpleasant parts of the institution. The work itself is arduous and monotonous. You might spend your days at the laundry tubs washing and mending clothes and linen for the government hospital, the military barracks, or other public institutions. Imagine the endless scrubbing your hands raw and chapped from the harsh soap and cold water. Or you could be set to carding and spinning wool, preparing it for weaving into coarse cloth. The original spin class, though decidedly less about wellness and more about producing rough fabric for convict clothing. Another common task was picking oakum, which involved unraveling old terry ropes into individual fibers, a tedious finger-shredding job that seemed designed to be as unpleasant as possible. Punishments within the factory walls are swift and often designed for maximum shame within this exclusively female environment. For minor rule breaking, you might have your rations reduced or be assigned extra unpleasant chores. For more serious offenses, such as fighting insubordination or attempting to escape, you could face solitary confinement in a dark cell, often damp and cold, much like the men endured. One particularly feared punishment, unique to the women's experience of institutional shaming, was having your head shaved. In an era where a woman's hair was a significant part of her identity and appearance, this was a profound humiliation, marking you publicly as a troublemaker. Historians still argue whether the female factories were primarily intended as places of protection and moral reform for what society then considered vulnerable or fallen women, or if they were essentially institutions designed for their economic exploitation through forced labor and their social control, ensuring a supply of female workers and potential wives for the male-dominated colony. From your perspective, scrubbing an officer's linen until your back aches or trying to soothe a crying child in a crowded, noisy dormitory, the loftier aims of moral reform might feel very distant indeed. One of the most significant aspects of life in the female factory was the constant awareness of being, in a sense, on display. Settlers' officials and even well-behaved male convicts looking for a wife could apply to the matron to select a woman from the factory. This led to a rather demeaning process, sometimes referred to with dark humor as the factory courtship or parade. A quirky tidbit is that women deemed eligible might be lined up, and the prospective husband would walk along inspecting them, perhaps asking a few perfunctory questions before making his choice. For many women, marriage, even to a stranger with unknown prospects, was seen as the only viable way to escape the factory and its hardships. But it was a choice made under immense pressure and with little real agency. It was the colonial version of a dating app, except the stakes were infinitely higher and your profile was basically able to do laundry and hopefully not cause too much trouble. The bonds between the women in the factory could be complex. There was undoubtedly solidarity, shared experiences of hardship, and friendships formed in the face of adversity. Women would look out for each other, share snippets of news or gossip, and offer comfort. However, the crowded conditions, the competition for scarce resources or preferential treatment, and the ever-present stress could also lead to tensions, arguments, and rivalries. You learn quickly who to trust and who to avoid. The presence of children, many born within the factory walls, added another layer of complexity and heartbreak as mothers struggled to care for their infants in such challenging conditions, often facing the prospect of being separated from them if assigned out, or if the child was old enough to be placed in the orphan school. It's a world within a world with its own rules, its own hierarchies, and its own particular brand of quiet desperation and occasional fierce resilience. Whether you've endured the specific hardships of the female factory, or the relentless grind of male convict life on the mainland, you might think you've seen the worst this colonial experiment has to offer. You've learned to navigate the hunger, the arbitrary discipline, the public shaming, and the soul-destroying labor. But for some, for those deemed truly incorrigible, for those who commit further serious crimes within the colony itself, or for those who simply possess a spirit, the authorities are determined to break utterly. There exists another layer of punishment, a descent into places that earned reputations as veritable hells on earth. You might hear them spoken of in hushed, fearful tones: Norfolk Island, Macquarie Harbor, Moreton Bay. These are the secondary penal settlements, the Isles of Second Death, where hope, it is said, goes to be extinguished entirely. If your colonial record is sufficiently blotted, or if you've made one too many daring or perhaps just desperate attempts to escape your servitude, you may find yourself sentenced to one of these notorious locales. The news itself is a blow often worse than your original sentence of transportation from Britain. Back then, you were naive, perhaps clinging to some sliver of hope about what lay ahead. Now you're a seasoned inmate of the system. You've heard the whispers, the horror stories. You know that being sent to Norfolk Island, for instance, during its second settlement period, is akin to a death sentence for your spirit. A mainstream historical fact is that places like Norfolk Island were intentionally re-established Norfolk from 1825 to be, in the chilling words of official correspondence, a place of the extremest punishment short of death, designed for the worst description of convicts. It was to be a place so terrible that it would deter even the most hardened criminals on the mainland. The commute, you can imagine, was memorable in all the wrong ways. The journey to these outposts is often a grim echo of your first voyage, but with an added layer of dread. You're packed onto a cramped vessel surrounded by others, equally condemned the mood, thick with despair. When you finally arrive, the very landscape can seem to confirm your worst fears. These settlements are typically chosen for their extreme isolation and natural inhospitality. Think rugged, storm-lashed coastlines, dense, impenetrable bush, shark-infested waters, all designed to make escape not just difficult but virtually impossible. The guards and officials stationed here are often those considered tough enough, or perhaps callous enough, to manage such a desperate and dangerous population. They certainly aren't there to win any congeniality awards. Upon arrival, you're immediately subjected to a regime even harsher than what you've previously known. The labor is backbreaking and often perilous. At Macquarie Harbor in Van Diemen's Land, for example, convicts were forced to fell giant Huon pine trees in dense, leech-infested rainforests, then manhandled the massive logs into the water, often working waist-deep in freezing conditions. At Norfolk Island, it might be quarrying stone for massive building projects or endless futile agricultural work on poor soil under the strictest, most unyielding supervision. The rations are likely to be even more meager, the discipline even more brutal and summary. The triangles for flogging are never far away, and the lash is wielded with a terrifying frequency. Any sign of defiance, any perceived slackening of effort, is met with immediate and severe retribution. The psychological impact of being in such a place is profound. It's the feeling of being completely cut off from the world, from any possibility of reprieve or redemption. This is what's meant by the second death. Not necessarily a physical demise, though that too is common enough through accident, disease, or violence, but the death of hope, the annihilation of any belief that your life might one day improve. You are in essence buried alive at the ends of the earth. The commandants of these settlements often became infamous figures ruling their isolated domains with near absolute power. Men like Major Joseph Anderson or James Morissette at Norfolk Island, or Captain Patrick Logan at Moreton Bay, developed reputations for extreme severity, their names becoming bywords for cruelty within the convict system. Historians still argue whether the extreme brutality that characterized these secondary penal settlements was a calculated policy of terror, meticulously sanctioned and directed from the higher colonial authorities, or if it was more the inevitable result of unchecked power being wielded by individual commandants and their underlings in geographically isolated environments, far from effective oversight. From your perspective, enduring the endless toil and the ever-present threat of violence, the distinction is academic. The result is the same: a life stripped bare of everything but suffering and fear. One of the most grimly quirky and telling tidbits about life in these ocean hells was the desperate measures some convicts undertook simply to escape their confines, even if that escape led directly to the gallows. There are documented instances from Norfolk Island of men committing murder not out of malice towards their victim, who was often a fellow convict, sometimes even a friend who colluded in the act, but solely to be sent back to Sydney or Hobart for trial. The gallows and a relatively swift end were seen as preferable to the slow, grinding agony and hopelessness of life on the island. That's a fairly damning indictment of a place when death becomes a sought-after alternative. Other desperate escape attempts involve trying to swim through treacherous, shark-patrolled waters, or vanishing into the dense, hostile bush, almost certainly to perish from starvation or exposure. The days are a blur of hard labor, harsh discipline, and gnawing hunger, all set against a backdrop of stunning natural beauty that seems to mock your inner desolation. The vibrant green of the Norfolk Island pines, the dramatic cliffs, the crashing blue waves. It's a paradise transformed into a penitentiary. There's little camaraderie here, as the system is designed to break all bonds to foster suspicion and betrayal. Every man is looking out for himself, trying to survive another day, another week. In this place where the rules of normal human interaction seem to have been suspended, replaced by a brutal calculus of survival. You might hear the distant clang of a hammer on stone, the shouts of an overseer, the mournful cry of a seabird. Sounds that become the dreary soundtrack to your despair. This, you realize, is the very bottom of the system. The place where the British Empire sent those it wished to forget and to make forget themselves. The names Norfolk Island or Macquarie Harbor might echo in your mind as the ultimate destinations of despair, the officially sanctioned naders of the convict system. But even if you manage to avoid being formally condemned to one of those notorious hells on earth, Gibaya, your journey through the landscape of colonial punishment isn't necessarily over. There's another, perhaps more insidious form of suffering that festers far from the gaze of magistrates and the meticulously kept records of officialdom. This is the realm of bush justice, the rough, unrecorded, and often brutal discipline meted out in the vast, isolated expanses of the Australian interior, where the only law is often the word of a solitary overseer or a remote settler. Imagine you're assigned not to a bustling government gang in Sydney, nor to a relatively supervised farm in the settled districts, but to a distant stock station hundreds of miles from the nearest courthouse. Or perhaps you're part of a small timber-felling party, deep in the dense forests, or a shepherd minding a flock in some lonely, sun-scorched valley. The isolation is profound. Weeks, even months might pass without seeing anyone beyond your immediate work party and the overseer in charge. In such a setting, the already immense power imbalance between convict and master, or convict and overseer, becomes almost absolute. Your HR department here, you might sardonically note, consists primarily of that one individual, and their mood swings can have very direct consequences. A mainstream historical fact is that a significant number of convicts were dispersed into these remote areas. The expanding pastoral industry, the insatiable demand for timber, and the slow creep of exploration and settlement all relied heavily on convict labor, far from the main population centers. In these isolated outposts, the formal mechanisms of justice, the magistrates, the courts, the official record keepers, are a distant dream. Here your overseer isn't just your boss. He's effectively your judge, jury, and all too often the administrator of punishments that never find their way into any official report. What does this bush justice look like? It's not typically the formalized ritual of the cat o' nine tails at a triangle, as there might not be the personnel or the inclination for such theater. Instead, it's often more direct, more brutal, and chillingly arbitrary. Perhaps you're deemed too slow at your work, or you lose a sheep, or you simply look at the overseer the wrong way on a bad day. The response could be a savage beating with a riding crop, a heavy piece of wood, or simply fists and boots. There are no witnesses whose word would count against the overseer's no surgeon to declare you unfit for further punishment, or indeed for work immediately afterwards. You might be tied to a tree or a fence post for hours, even days, exposed to the blistering sun, the freezing nights, or the torment of insects with minimal food and water. The complaints box you might wryly observe is probably just a particularly uninviting wombat hole, and its occupant is unlikely to be sympathetic to your plight. The ingenuity of cruelty can flourish in such isolated environments. You might hear tales passed in hushed whispers among convicts of specific overseers on remote stations who had their own signature forms of torment. A quirky tidbit could be an overseer forcing a convict to carry an absurdly heavy log back and forth for no reason other than to inflict pain and exhaustion, or making someone stand on an anthill, or being confined in a cramped, dark-grained silo for days. The Australian bush itself, with its harsh extremes, becomes both a witness and an accomplice to these unrecorded punishments. Being left without adequate shelter or forced to perform tasks in dangerous terrain without proper equipment could be a death sentence delivered by apparent accident or misadventure. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of this kind of informal, often brutal bush justice was a sign of a fundamental systemic failure in colonial oversight and the administration of law in remote territories, or if it was an almost inevitable, if deeply regrettable consequence of the rapid and often chaotic expansion of the colony into vast, sparsely populated areas, with severely limited resources for formal law enforcement and communication. For you, shivering through a cold night, after being denied your blanket for some minor infraction, or nursing bruised ribs from an overseer's correction, the academic debate offers little comfort. Your reality is the immediate, unchecked power of one individual over your entire existence. The psychological toll of this isolation and arbitrary power is immense. There's the constant, simmering fear. With no recourse, no one to appeal to, you live in a state of perpetual anxiety, trying to anticipate the overseer's moods to avoid giving any cause for offense, however slight. Your world shrinks to the confines of the remote station or work camp. Your interactions limited to a handful of people, one of whom holds your fate in their hands. It's a breeding ground for despair, for a sense of utter helplessness. You might feel like you've fallen off the edge of the map into a place where the normal rules of human decency, flawed as they were, even in the main settlements, have completely evaporated. Even if you are not the direct recipient of the worst abuses, witnessing them or hearing the sounds of another convict being subjected to discipline just out of sight creates an atmosphere of pervasive terror. You learn that survival often depends on silence, on not drawing attention to yourself, on becoming as invisible as possible. The vast ancient landscape with its strange beauty and its underlying harshness seems indifferent to your suffering. The kookaburras laugh in the trees, the kangaroos graze placidly in the distance, all while human dramas of cruelty and endurance play out in tiny, forgotten corners of the bush. It's a stark reminder that beyond the official ledgers and the grand narratives of colonial expansion, there are countless unwritten stories of suffering resilience and the quiet, desperate struggle to simply survive another day under a system where justice could be as unpredictable and as harsh as the land itself. The raw fear of an overseer's unchecked rage in some lonely stretch of bush, the sting of the lash, the gnawing hunger, these are the more overt weapons in the colonial arsenal of control. But beyond these immediate physical assaults, there's a slower, more insidious campaign waged against you. A relentless pressure aimed not just at your body, but at the very core of who you are. It's the steady grinding erosion of your spirit, a collection of subtle and overt methods designed to break your will and hollow out your identity until you become little more than a compliant cog in the vast, unforgiving machine of the penal colony. One of the first casualties is your name, the very label of your existence. While you still possess it in the official ledgers and in the minds of your overseers, you are often reduced to a number. A more convenient designation for record-keeping and roll calls. Your personal clothing. Those last remnants of your life before conviction were likely taken from you long ago, replaced by the coarse, ill-fitting institutional garments known as slops. Rough shirts, trousers, and perhaps a shapeless hat, all in drab uniform colors. A mainstream historical fact is that this issuance of uniform clothing and the use of numbers were deliberate tools of depersonalization, stripping away individuality and reinforcing your status as mere convict stock. You look around at your fellow prisoners and you all look dismally, depressingly the same. It's a visual reminder that your unique past, your individual story counts for little here. Then there's the relentless monotony. Whether it's the pointless toil of the crank machine, the endless drudgery of a work gang clearing yet another acre of stubborn bushland, or the repetitive tasks in a female factory, the routine is designed to be mind-numbing. There's little room for initiative, creativity, or personal satisfaction in the work. Its very pointlessness at times feels like a deliberate mockery of your efforts, a way to drum into you the utter futility of your existence. Your sense of self-worth isn't exactly a line item on the colonial budget. They seem to offer a very comprehensive demotivational program available to all free of charge. Constant surveillance is another powerful tool for eroding your spirit. You always feel watched. Overseers guard sentries. Their eyes are everywhere. But perhaps even more unnerving is the knowledge that your fellow convicts might also be watching, not out of camaraderie, but for the chance to gain some small favor by reporting an infraction. The authorities actively encouraged the use of informers or snitches, creating an atmosphere of pervasive mistrust that could poison relationships and break down any sense of solidarity. How can you form genuine bonds, share your true feelings, or even plan a moment of harmless collective respite when you fear your words might be carried back to those in power? It's a lonely, isolating way to live even when surrounded by hundreds of others. The arbitrary nature of the system further grinds you down. One overseer might be relatively lenient, another a tyrant. A particular magistrate might hand down 50 lashes for an offense that another dismisses with a warning. There seems to be no rhyme or reason, no consistent application of justice, which leaves you feeling perpetually off balance, unable to predict the consequences of your actions, or to feel any sense of control over your fate. This can lead to a state of learned helplessness, where you simply give up trying, accepting the endless stream of misery as inevitable. At least you had plenty of time for introspection, though most of it probably revolved around just how comprehensively dreadful your situation was. Separation from everything you knew and loved is, of course, a foundational element of your punishment. The vast distance from your homeland, the infrequent and heavily censored communication, if any at all, means that your past life begins to feel like a dream. the faces of your family, the streets of your hometown, the very culture that shaped you, all recede, becoming faint and indistinct. This profound sense of exile, this severing of roots, can lead to a deep, aching despair, a feeling that you are truly lost to the world. The authorities naturally did little to alleviate this, as a convict connected to their past might still possess a spark of the person they once were. A spark that needed to be extinguished for the system to work most effectively. Historians still argue whether the profound psychological breakdown and erosion of identity experienced by so many convicts was an explicitly intentional strategic outcome of the penal system's design, aimed at creating a docile and subjugated workforce, or if it was largely an unfortunate but secondary consequence of the system's inherent harshness, overcrowding, and deprivation. From where you stand, feeling the weight of it all, it certainly feels like a concerted effort. Yet even in the face of such overwhelming pressure, the human spirit has a remarkable capacity for quiet resistance. A quirky tidbit that often emerges from convict narratives is the development of small, almost invisible ways to cling to a sense of self. Perhaps it's the secret fashioning of a tiny personal trinket from a piece of bone or wood hidden from the overseers. Maybe it's the silent sharing of a story or a song from home, whispered in the dead of night when detection is less likely. Convicts developed their own slang and argot that was unintelligible to their jailers, creating a small, private world of shared understanding. These weren't grand acts of rebellion, but they were tiny sparks of individuality, flickers of defiance against the crushing weight of the system. Assertions that I am still here, I am still human. Even the act of observing and remembering, of vowing to one day tell the tale, could be a way of preserving a part of yourself that the system was trying so hard to erase. But it's an exhausting battle, this internal struggle to remain whole when everything around you is designed to pull you apart piece by weary piece. As you navigate the treacherous currents of the convict system, battling the erosion of your spirit and the constant physical hardships, you become aware of another complex and often perilous dimension to life. In this new land, the presence of the original inhabitants, the Aboriginal peoples. Your interactions with them, or even your attempts to avoid interaction, can become yet another trigger for the long arm of colonial punishment, to fall upon you often with severe and unpredictable consequences. The rules here are unwritten, deeply misunderstood by newcomers like yourself, and enforced by your colonial masters with an eye more towards expediency and control than any real justice. Your first encounters might be fleeting glimpses of dark figures moving silently through the bush at the edge of your worksite, or the discovery of unfamiliar tracks and encampments. The official stance from the early governors like Arthur Phillip was often one of desiring amity and forbidding molestation of the indigenous population. A mainstream historical fact is that proclamations were issued threatening severe punishment for any colonist, convict, or free who committed violence or theft against Aboriginal people. However, the chasm between official policy issued from a tent in Sydney Cove and the reality on the ground in remote areas or even on the turbulent frontiers of the settlement was bjate. Your overseer might give you stern warnings, have nothing to do with them, don't go near them, don't trade with them. Yes, but curiosity, desperation, or simple accident could easily lead you to ignore these edicts. Imagine you're stationed on a remote farm or a distant stock run. Perhaps driven by hunger, you foolishly try to take fish from a trap you discover in a stream, not understanding it's a vital food source for a local Aboriginal group. Or maybe you try to trade a piece of your meager sugar ration for some fresh game or information directly contravening your master's orders. If an altercation arises, or if items go missing from either side, the blame, and subsequently the punishment from your colonial superiors, could very well land squarely on your shoulders. It doesn't always matter who started it or what the nuances of the misunderstanding were. You as the convict are the easiest scapegoat, the one whose word counts for, at least the one whose punishment serves as a convenient example. Don't accidentally stir up trouble with the natives. It becomes another unwritten rule you have to learn, often the hard way. Your intercultural sensitivity training, you'll find, was rather conspicuously absent from your processing upon arrival. The consequences for such transgressions, real or perceived, could be severe. If your actions were seen to genuinely endanger the fragile peace or the safety of a settler outpost, you might face a flogging, be clapped in irons, or be sent to an even worse place of punishment like a penal settlement for endangering His Majesty's subjects or disobeying orders. It's a bitter irony. You're punished by your own people for interactions stemming from a conflict that your people as a whole initiated by their very presence on this land. A quirky, though often tragic tidbit from this era involves misunderstandings around the concept of property. For Aboriginal people who had lived on the land for tens of thousands of years, notions of land ownership and resource use were vastly different from European ideas of fences, deeds, and exclusive possession. A convict, perhaps seeing unattended tools or kangaroos grazing on what their master now claimed as his pasture, might act in a way that, while understandable from a European perspective of finders keepers or utilizing common resources, was a deep offense or a depletion of vital sustenance to the local Aboriginal group. If this led to retaliatory spearing of sheep or cattle or even attacks on settlers, any convict even tangentially involved or simply present in the area could be rounded up and punished by the colonial authorities for provoking the incident. Turns out finders keepers wasn't quite the universally accepted legal doctrine you might have hoped. Historians still argue whether official punishments meted out by the colonial system to its own convicts for offenses against Aboriginal people were primarily genuine, if flawed, attempts at upholding some semblance of British justice and maintaining peaceful relations, or if they were more often pragmatic acts of colonial self-preservation, designed to manage the colony's reputation, control its convict workforce, and prevent wider conflicts that might threaten the tenuous hold of the settlement. The fear of Aboriginal reprisal was very real for many settlers, especially in isolated areas. If a convict was involved in an incident that led to such reprisal, their master or the local authorities might punish them with particular severity, not necessarily out of a sense of justice for any Indigenous victims, but to demonstrate to other settlers and perhaps to any watching Aboriginal eyes that such provocations would not be tolerated from the convict class. You might find yourself caught in a terrible bind, at risk from Indigenous retaliation if your fellow colonists commit outrages, and at risk of punishment from your colonial masters if your own actions, however well-intentioned or ignorant, lead to trouble. There were also instances where convicts attempted to abscond and live with Aboriginal groups. Some were seeking refuge, others perhaps genuinely intrigued or hoping for a better life. The success of such endeavors varied wildly. Some were killed. Others were eventually returned to the settlements by the Aboriginal people themselves, and a very few managed to integrate for a time. If caught and returned to the colonial system after such an escapade, the punishment was usually extreme, often involving a severe flogging and transportation to a penal settlement. You were, after all, government property, and choosing a different unapproved form of servitude was not an option. So you learned to navigate yet another layer of unwritten rules and unspoken threats. The vast ancient land holds not just the promise of backbreaking labor and the scrutiny of your overseers, but also the complex presence of its first peoples whose laws and customs you barely comprehend, and whose interactions with your world can bring swift and severe consequences down upon your already burdened head. It's a dangerous, unpredictable frontier, and you are walking it in chains. The perils of encounter with the Indigenous peoples. The ever-present threat of official retribution for transgressing complex and poorly understood boundaries. These are the stark, dramatic dangers of your convict life. But as you become more enmeshed in the system, as you learn its rhythms and its unspoken rules, you also come to a chilling realization. It's not just the grand transgressions that can bring you undone. In this meticulously managed world of punishment, even the tiniest of slips, the most minor of infractions, can incur a terrible disproportionate cost. You learn that your life is governed by 1,000 invisible tripwires, and a moment of carelessness, a word spoken out of turn, even a perceived look of defiance can send you tumbling back into the abyss of official displeasure. It's an atmosphere of constant grinding discipline. You might think that by keeping your head down, working diligently, and avoiding the more obvious pitfalls like escape attempts or theft, you can navigate your sentence with minimal suffering. But the definition of an offense in this colony is remarkably elastic, and the zeal for punishment often seems to outweigh any sense of proportion. The employee handbook, if such a thing existed, would probably be a single ominous sentence. Do nothing at any time under any circumstances that might vaguely annoy someone in authority. Good luck with that. Consider the crime of insolence. This isn't about raising a hand against an overseer. It can be as simple as not appearing deferential enough, perhaps failing to remove your hat quickly enough, or muttering under your breath when given an unpleasant order. There's even the wonderfully vague charge of dumb insolence, which could mean you simply looked at an overseer in a way they didn't appreciate or failed to show sufficient enthusiasm for your latest soul-destroying task. For such a crime against colonial etiquette, you could easily find yourself on the receiving end of 25 lashes or a few days in solitary confinement on bread and water. Apparently, maintaining an expression of perpetual cheerful gratitude for your servitude was an unwritten yet strictly enforced expectation. Then there's malingering, the act of feigning illness or exaggerating an injury to avoid work. Given the harsh labor, the poor diet, and the often unsanitary conditions, genuine sickness is rife. But if your claims of illness are deemed suspect by an overseer or a harassed colonial surgeon, whose primary role often seems to be getting men back to work, you're in for trouble. Instead of a day of rest, you might get a taste of the lash for your supposed deceit. A truly effective way to encourage a swift recovery, or at least a swifter return to your duties, however unwell you might feel. A mainstream historical fact evident from even a cursory glance at the surviving convict records and magistrates' court summaries is the astonishing frequency with which severe punishments were meted out for what we would today consider trivialities. Neglect of work, perhaps not scrubbing a floor quite vigorously enough or leaving a tool uncleaned, could earn you a flogging. Being out of barracks after hours, even by a few minutes, could see you confined. The theft of a biscuit, a piece of fruit, or a tiny scrap of tobacco driven by hunger or craving was almost certain to result in a harsh penalty. The system seemed designed to catch you out to remind you constantly of your subjugation. The interpretation of these tiny slips often rested entirely on the mood prejudice or even the personal vendettas of your overseer or master. A kind word from one might be ignored, while the same word or even silence offered to another might be twisted into an act of defiance. This arbitrariness is part of what makes the system so psychologically wearing. There's no clear path to safety, no reliable way to ensure you stay out of trouble because the rules can feel like they're constantly shifting, dependent on the whims of those who hold power over you. You'd almost wish for an award for most trivial offense leading to ludicrously disproportionate retribution. But alas, your suffering was its own reward for the system at least. A quirky and often maddening aspect of this was the sheer specificity of some rules or the unique pet peeves of certain individuals in charge. One overseer might fly into a rage if he heard convicts whistling a particular tune he disliked. Another might have an obsession with the precise way tools were to be stacked at the end of the day, and any deviation would result in instant punishment. You might learn through bitter experience or the misfortune of others that looking sideways at a particular guard while he was eating his lunch was a punishable offense, or that laughing too loudly, even in your own precious moments of respite, could be construed as disorderly conduct. It was like walking through a minefield blindfolded, where the minds were shaped like unspoken expectations and petty annoyances. Historians still argue whether this intense focus on disciplining even the most minor infractions was a calculated system-wide strategy designed to maintain total psychological dominance over the convict population and preempt any possibility of larger-scale disobedience or rebellion, or if it was simply a reflection of the era's generally harsh penal philosophies, amplified by the anxieties and often unchecked power of individuals managing a coerced workforce in a remote and challenging environment. Whatever the grand strategy or lack thereof, the effect on you is a state of constant, low-level anxiety. You find yourself second-guessing every action, every word. You try to make yourself as small, as unobtrusive as possible. But human beings are not machines. You get tired, you get frustrated, you make mistakes. And in this system, there is precious little room for error. A careless moment, a thoughtless comment, a brief lapse in a day filled with hours of exhausting labor. And suddenly you're facing the triangle or the dark cell or the news that more months have been added to your sentence. These tiny slips, these seemingly insignificant moments accumulate each one another. Small chip away at your resilience, another reinforcement of the terrible disproportionate power that governs every facet of your life in this unforgiving land. The relentless scrutiny, the ever-present threat of severe punishment for even the most trivial of mistakes, this becomes the suffocating rhythm of your days, your years in the colony. You learn to live with a knot of anxiety in your stomach, to walk on eggshells, to make yourself as small and compliant as possible. Yet even in this landscape of despair, after what feels like an eternity of servitude, a faint, almost unbelievable glimmer of something different might appear on the horizon. It's a whisper at first, a rumor in the barracks, then perhaps a formal notice the possibility of a ticket of leave. This isn't true freedom, not by a long shot. You're not suddenly a free citizen able to pack your bags and sail home, or even to wander wherever you please within this vast, strange continent. But a ticket of leave, should you be fortunate enough, or perhaps just resilient enough to earn one, is a significant step away from the direct daily coercion of government gangs or assigned service. A mainstream historical fact is that the ticket of leave system was an integral part of convict management, designed as an incentive for good behavior and a mechanism for gradually releasing convicts into the general population while still maintaining a degree of control. Typically, you become eligible after serving a substantial portion of your original sentence, perhaps 4 years on a 7-year sentence, 6 on a 14-year, and so on, provided your record wasn't too blotted with disciplinary actions. That good conduct part is key. All those tiny slips we talked about could accumulate to deny you this precious chance. Imagine the moment after years of being told where to go, what to do, when to eat, when to sleep. You're handed a piece of paper. This document, your ticket of leave, grants you permission to work for yourself, to seek your own employment with an approved master of your choosing, and to live in a specified district. You can, in theory, earn your own wages, acquire property, and begin to carve out some semblance of an independent life. It's like being on probation, but with a distinctly colonial flavor. More flies, probably, and a much higher chance of everything going catastrophically wrong if you're not careful. Freedom-ish, you might call it, like sugar-free sugar or silent alarm clocks. A concept that sounds promising but comes with significant caveats. The conditions attached to your ticket are numerous and strict. You must reside within the boundaries of your designated district. Stray outside without permission, and you're in serious trouble. You have to report regularly to the local magistrate or police establishment, perhaps attending a Sunday muster or church service where your presence is duly noted. This is partly to ensure you haven't absconded, and partly to reinforce moral rectitude, or so the theory goes. You must be of good character and conduct, a wonderfully vague requirement that can be interpreted in any number of ways by those in authority. You're often forbidden from associating with other convicts still under sentence, which can be incredibly difficult when these are the only people you've known for years, your only social circle. Entering a public house or being found intoxicated could also lead to instant revocation of your precious ticket. Your new parole officer, in effect, is any local constable, magistrate, or even just an influential busybody with a suspicious nature and a willingness to make a complaint. This liberty, therefore, is incredibly precarious. The glimmer of hope it represents is fragile, easily extinguished. A minor offense, something that a free settler might get away with a small fine for, could see your ticket of leave canceled without a second thought. Suspicion alone, even without concrete proof of wrongdoing, could be enough if a magistrate or powerful individual took a dislike to you, and the penalties for breaching your conditions or for committing any new offense are severe. Your ticket is revoked, and you're typically returned to government service, often to a harsher work gang than before your taste of semi-freedom, making the return to chains and overseers all the more bitter. You might face a flogging or have your original sentence extended. It's back to square one, or even further behind the brief interlude of self-determination, now just a painful memory. A quirky yet telling aspect of this conditional liberty was the constant need to prove your status. Ticket of leave holders were usually required to carry their actual ticket on their person at all times. If stopped by a constable or anyone in authority, you had to produce this document on demand. Failure to do so, even if you were a legitimate holder and had simply forgotten it or lost it, could lead to immediate arrest and punishment as a suspected runaway. Imagine the anxiety of that. Your entire fragile liberty dependent on a flimsy piece of paper that could easily be damaged, stolen, or misplaced. Some ticket holders trying to navigate the tricky social currents found that certain professions were more open to them, while others remained firmly closed, the stigma of their convict past clinging to them despite the ticket. Historians still argue whether the ticket of leave system was primarily a genuinely reformative measure aimed at the gradual rehabilitation and reintegration of convicts into colonial society, or if it was at its core a pragmatic and cost-effective tool for the government to reduce its expenditure on maintaining a vast convict population while simultaneously providing a flexible, semi-controlled labor force for the colony's development. For you holding that precious document, the theories matter less than the daily reality. You find work perhaps as a farm laborer, a shepherd, a sawyer, or if you have a trade as a carpenter or blacksmith. You find your own lodgings, meager as they might be. You earn your own money, and for the first time in years you have some small measure of control over your own life. But the fear never truly leaves you. Every interaction with authority is fraught with tension. Every unfamiliar face could be someone looking to cause trouble. You guard your ticket and your conduct with a fierce, anxious vigilance. This precarious glimmer of liberty is hard-won, easily lost, and a constant, stressful reminder that while you may no longer be directly under the lash or in chains, you are still in the eyes of the law and society, a convict living on borrowed time under the ever-watchful eye of the system. And so your long, arduous journey through the forgotten punishments of this early colonial world begins ever so slowly to shift. The sharp edges of daily fear, the constant grind of imposed suffering, may for you with this fragile ticket in hand begin to soften just a little. Or perhaps your path has led you elsewhere to a different kind of quiet, a different form of endurance. Imagine now that the day's toils, whether real or recounted, are truly done. The sun, which beat down so mercilessly on the work gangs and the solitary figures in ironed chains, has finally dipped below the horizon. A cooler breeze whispers through the strange gray-green leaves of the gum trees, carrying with it the distant, mournful calls of night birds, so different from those of your homeland. The harsh sounds of the settlement, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the overseer's shout, the rumble of cartwheels, fade into a deeper quiet punctuated only by the chirping of crickets or the gentle rustle of unseen creatures in the bush. Allow yourself to feel the weariness, not as a burden now, but as a release. Your muscles, though they may ache from remembered exertions, can finally soften, can finally let go. There are no more demands on you tonight, no more tasks to complete, no more scrutiny to endure. The vast, star-dusted southern sky arches overhead a silent, impartial witness to all that is past and all that is now blessedly still. Let the stories, the hardships, the anxieties drift away like smoke from a dying campfire, leaving only the peace of this present moment. You are safe, you are comfortable, and you are ready for rest. The only journey you need to make now is the gentle one into sleep, into dreams, where the chains are gone and the only sounds are those that soothe and calm your weary spirit. That fragile ticket of leave, if you've managed to attain it, represents a narrow, precarious path towards a semblance of normalcy. A path paved with constant anxiety and the fear of misplacing a single step. But for many, both those with and without such conditional liberty, the fundamental injustice of their transportation, the daily grind of servitude, or the sheer soul-crushing weight of the system itself becomes utterly unbearable. The dream of true freedom of unshackled movement and self-determination, or simply the raw human need to resist utter subjugation, can burn too brightly to be extinguished by mere rules and regulations. And so you witness or perhaps even contemplate acts of defiance of escape, and the swift, terrible retribution that inevitably follows, designed to crush those dreams into dust. The desire to abscond, to bolt into the vast unknown Australian bush, is a recurring theme in the convict narrative. It's a desperate gamble born of misery. Some dream of reaching another European settlement, however distant. Others, fueled by fantastical tales and a profound ignorance of geography, believe they might somehow walk to China or India. A quirky but tragically common delusion among early transportees that speaks volumes about their desperation and lack of worldly knowledge. Still others simply crave anonymity, the chance to disappear into the wilderness and live off the land free from overseers and irons. The Colonial Travel Agency for Unscheduled Departures, you might grimly reflect, had a notably strict no refunds policy and an almost guaranteed unpleasant follow-up service. Then there are the more direct acts of defiance, a refusal to work an open challenge to an overseer's authority, or in rarer, more desperate cases, an organized protest or even a mutinous uprising within a work gang or barracks. These are met with immediate, overwhelming force. The system cannot tolerate any crack in its facade of absolute control. A mainstream historical fact is that absconding was one of the most common offenses recorded against convicts, and the punishments were uniformly severe. Recaptured escapees could expect a merciless flogging, often hundreds of lashes designed not just to punish, but to physically incapacitate and psychologically scar. Their sentences would be extended, any privileges revoked, and they were frequently marked for transportation to a secondary penal settlement, like Norfolk Island or Moreton Bay, those hells on earth reserved for the worst of the worst. The pursuit of escapees is a relentless, efficient operation. Mounted police arm settlers forming posses and sometimes Aboriginal trackers skilled in navigating the bush and reading signs invisible to European eyes are deployed to hunt down bolters. The vastness of the continent, which might seem to offer sanctuary, more often becomes a deadly trap, with starvation, dehydration, or simply getting hopelessly lost, being common fates for those who elude immediate capture. For those who turn to bushranging, robbing settlers or travelers to survive while at large, the stakes become even higher. If caught, they face almost certain execution, their deaths serving as a public spectacle to deter others. Apparently, freedom of movement in your convict terms and conditions had some very large, very sharp asterisks attached. You might witness the grim procession of a recaptured escapee being marched back into the settlement, exhausted, bedraggled, and already bearing the marks of rough handling. The subsequent punishment is often public, a deliberate piece of theater designed to instill fear in all who watch. The floggings are brutal, the pronouncements of extended sentences or transportation to a penal hell delivered with cold finality. If the crime involved violence or leading others astray, a trial before the criminal court might end with the judge donning the black cap and pronouncing a sentence of death. Executions, too, are public affairs. The condemned often encouraged to make a final speech, admitting their folly and warning others against a similar path. Though whether these speeches were genuine or coerced is another matter. Historians still argue whether the extreme severity of punishments for escape and defiance was primarily driven by a pragmatic and calculated need to maintain discipline and control over a vast, unwilling, and potentially dangerous labor force, or if it also contained a significant element of symbolic retribution. A furious, almost theatrical assertion of the empire's absolute authority against those who dared to openly challenge its dominion. Beyond the dramatic escapes, even smaller acts of collective defiance, a work gang refusing a dangerous task or a group of convicts in a barracks protesting about inedible food, are met with uncompromising severity. Ringleaders are singled out, flogged, and often removed to harsher conditions. The message is clear: individual suffering is guaranteed, but collective resistance is impossible and will be met with the full, crushing weight of the system. Their motto for dealing with any form of rebellion might as well have been, "We will find you, we will break you, and it will be exceedingly unpleasant for all involved." The psychological impact of witnessing these crushed dreams is profound. Each failed escape attempt, each brutally suppressed act of defiance, each public punishment serves as another stark lesson in the futility of resistance. It grinds down hope, fosters a sense of powerlessness, and reinforces the idea that the system is an omnipotent, inescapable entity. For every convict who dared to dream of freedom and paid the terrible price, there were hundreds more who watched, learned and buried their own aspirations a little deeper, resigning themselves to their fate, or clinging ever more desperately to the slim, precarious hope offered by things like the ticket of leave. The dream of true, unfettered liberty for most remained just that, a dream swiftly and brutally dispelled by the harsh light of colonial retribution. The brutal suppression of any dream of escape, the swift and merciless retribution for acts of defiance, these serve their grim purpose. The colony, for the most part, remains outwardly subdued. The convicts toiling on their spirits battered their hopes, if not entirely extinguished, then certainly burning very low. But the story doesn't end with the silence that follows the lash or the clang of the cell door on a recaptured absconder. The relentless system of punishment. The years of suffering, the arbitrary justice all leave an indelible mark, not just on your individual soul, but on the very psyche of the burgeoning colonial society. These are the lingering shadows of pain, subtle, often unacknowledged, yet powerfully shaping the attitudes, fears, and strange customs of this new world built on a foundation of unfreedom. As the years pass, you might, if you survive long enough to become an emancipist, a convict who has served their time or earned a pardon, begin to observe these shadows playing out in the generations around you. You see it in the way people talk about authority, a curious mixture of ingrained deference and a deep, simmering resentment. There's a wariness around anyone in a uniform. a suspicion of officialdom that seems to whisper down from the days of the all-powerful overseers and capricious magistrates. It turns out building a society with a foundational layer of state-sanctioned unhappiness and arbitrary power has some lasting after-effects on the collective personality. A mainstream historical fact is that by the time transportation officially ceased to New South Wales in 1840 and to Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania, a bit later, ex-convicts and their descendants constituted a very significant proportion of the population. This convict stain, as it was sometimes called, with a sneer by later more respectable arrivals, couldn't simply be washed away. It was woven into the very fabric of Australian life. You notice it in the language, the development of a unique Australian slang or argot peppered with terms born in the convict hulks, the chain gangs, and the isolated huts. Words for betrayal, for solidarity, for authority, for survival. The national motto wasn't officially "Don't daub in your mate," but that sentiment born from the necessity of not betraying fellow sufferers to the overseers certainly developed a strong unspoken currency. You might observe the currency lads and lasses, the first generation born in the colony, often to convict parents. This is a quirky, fascinating development. These Australian-born children, unlike their parents, who carried the direct memories of Britain and the trauma of transportation, grow up with a different perspective. They are often fiercely independent, sometimes carrying a chip on their shoulder against the sterling. Those born in Britain, especially the free settlers who look down on the convict stock. They have a unique resilience, a pragmatic toughness, perhaps, but also a share of that inherited suspicion of power. The very landscape bears the scars and triumphs of convict labor. The roads you walk on, the bridges you cross, the grand stone buildings in Sydney, the cleared farmlands. Many were built by the sweat and toil of men and women in chains under the threat of punishment. These physical reminders are everywhere, silent testaments to the system that created them. And with these places sometimes come the ghost stories. The local legends of tormented spirits still haunting the sites of old jails, or particularly notorious punishment spots, folklore whispering of the pain embedded in the very stones. Historians still argue whether the harsh convict system ultimately brutalized the emerging Australian society, ingraining authoritarian tendencies and a cynical disregard for the law. Or if paradoxically the shared experience of suffering and the eventual success of many emancipists in forging new lives fostered a unique spirit of egalitarianism, mateship, and a defiant anti-authoritarianism. Perhaps as you look around, you see elements of both. You see a society that values hard work because idleness was so severely punished. You see a tendency towards mutual support among the lower orders because relying on authority was often a fool's errand. But you also see a lingering harshness, a quickness to judge perhaps, or an acceptance of a certain level of official force that might seem shocking to an outsider. The fear of punishment, even when the direct threat has receded for individuals, can cast a long shadow. It might manifest in an overcautious approach to life, a reluctance to speak out, or a deep-seated anxiety about attracting the wrong kind of attention from those in power. The memory of those tiny slips leading to terrible costs which you learned about in Section 14 doesn't just vanish when the chains come off. It can become an ingrained pattern of cautious behavior, passed down through families, shaping how people interact with the world. Therapy for an entire colony, grappling with its foundational traumas, probably wasn't high on the early governors' agendas. And so, as this raw new society begins to stumble towards its own identity, it carries within it these complex, often contradictory legacies of its brutal beginnings. The shadows of the triangles, the echo of the leg irons, the memory of hunger and humiliation. They don't simply disappear with the granting of pardons or the passage of time. They seep into the soil, into the language, into the way people see themselves and each other, ensuring that the forgotten punishments of those early, desperate years continue to shape the character of this land in ways both seen and unseen for generations to come. Word count 1395. And so your long, arduous journey through the forgotten punishments of this early colonial world begins ever so slowly to shift. The sharp edges of daily fear, the constant grind of imposed suffering, may for you as you reflect on these lingering shadows begin to resolve into a broader understanding, a sense of history settling. Imagine now that the day's explorations, whether real or recounted, are truly done. The sun, which cast such long telling shadows over the tales of the past, has finally dipped below the horizon. A cooler breeze whispers through the strange gray-green leaves of the gum trees, carrying with it the distant, mournful calls of night birds so different from those of any other land. The harsh sounds of the settlement, the clang of memory, the overseer's shout in a distant story, the rumble of ghostly cartwheels might fade into a deeper quiet, punctuated only by the chirping of crickets or the gentle rustle of unseen creatures in the bush. The soft sounds of the here and now. Allow yourself to feel the weariness, not as a burden now, but as a release. Your muscles, though they may ache from the day's tensions or remembered exertions, can finally soften, can finally let go. There are no more demands on you tonight, no more tasks to complete, no more scrutiny to endure. The vast star-dusted southern sky arches overhead, a silent, impartial witness to all that is past and all that is now blessedly still. Let the stories, the hardships, the anxieties drift away like smoke from a dying campfire, leaving only the peace of this present moment. You are safe, you are comfortable, and you are ready for rest. The only journey you need to make now is the gentle one into sleep, into dreams where all burdens are light, and the only sounds are those that soothe and calm your weary spirit.